The cold was a physical thing in that town, a presence that had less to do with the heavy gray sky and more to do with the pinched faces of the people who hurried along the boardwalks. It was a cold that sank its teeth into the frozen mud of the main street and refused to let go. It seeped through the clapboard walls of the mercantile and soured the milk in the saloon. For the woman and her two small children, huddled in the sliver of space between the undertaker's office and the livery stable, the cold was a predator. It stalked them in the wind that sliced through their threadbare coats made for a different climate, a different life. It hunted them in the hollow ache of their bellies and in the blue tint of their lips. The townspeople flowed around them like a river around a stone, their gazes sliding past, refusing to acknowledge the small, miserable island of humanity shivering in their midst. They were foreign, their features and the tattered remnants of their clothing marking them as outsiders, debris washed up on a hostile shore. The woman held her daughter tight against her chest, the child's small, shuddering breaths a fragile rhythm against her own ribs. Her son, no older than 7, stood with a rigid bravery that broke her heart, his small fists clenched at his sides as he stared defiantly at the legs of the men who passed. He saw them the moment he swung down from his horse. He was a man made of the same hard materials as the land he worked, solid, deliberate, weathered by sun and silence. His journey to town was a rare and necessary evil, a brief foray into a world of noise and people he had long since abandoned. He was there for salt, flour, and coffee, a simple list for a simple existence. But the sight of them stopped him. He did not feel pity. Pity was a soft, useless emotion he could not afford. Instead, a grim sort of recognition settled in his gut. He saw not their destitution, but the architecture of their despair. He saw the way the woman's spine remained straight, despite the crushing weight of her circumstance. The way her son's chin was lifted in a pantomime of strength. He saw a mirror of his own solitude, only his was a cavern carved by loss, and theirs was a desert of want. He stood there for a long moment, the sack of flour heavy on his shoulder, his mind a quiet ledger calculating costs and risks. The silence in his cabin had become a living thing in recent years, a roommate that was growing too loud to bear. It echoed with voices that were no longer there, with laughter he could only faintly recall. He needed help, a mender for his clothes, a cook for his meals, someone to push back against the encroaching emptiness. He had come to town half considering hiring a man from the saloon, some drifter who would likely drink his wages and be gone by spring. But this was a different kind of solution, a more complicated one. The sky was darkening, the clouds thickening into a bruised purple that promised a blizzard. He made his decision with the same lack of sentiment he applied to culling in six steer. He walked toward them, his boots making a heavy, purposeful sound on the wooden planks. The woman flinched as his shadow fell over her, her arm tightening around her daughter. The boy stepped in front of her, a tiny, hopeless sentinel. The man stopped a few feet away. He did not offer platitudes or comfort. His voice, when it came, was rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. "I need a cook," he said, his gaze fixed on the woman. "And a mender. My place is a day's ride from here. There's a storm coming. You can work for your keep. A roof and food." It was not an offer of salvation. It was a transaction. He stated his need, and he saw hers. He did not ask for her story or offer his own. He simply laid out the terms of survival on the frozen ground between them. The woman stared at him, her dark eyes searching his face for the hook hidden within the bait. She found nothing but a stark, unreadable emptiness. She looked at her son, whose brave facade was beginning to crumble. She looked down at her daughter, whose shivering had grown more violent. The wind howled, a promise of the storm's imminent fury. There was no other option. There was only this man, a stranger who looked as harsh as the winter itself, and the abyss at her back. Her pride, a brittle and starved thing, finally broke. She gave a single, sharp nod. "We will work," she said, her voice a reedy whisper, almost lost in the wind. He nodded back, the deal sealed. "Get your things." He turned and walked away without waiting to see if they would follow, already loading his supplies onto the pack mule. He knew they would. They had nowhere else to go. The journey to his homestead was a silent battle against the elements. The promised storm arrived with a savage roar. unleashing a blinding wall of snow that turned the world into a churned vortex of white. The man rode ahead, a solid shape against the chaos, his shoulders hunched against the wind's assault. The woman followed on the mule, her children bundled in front of her. He had taken off his own heavy sheepskin coat and wrapped it around the boy without a word, the gesture so impersonal it felt less like kindness and more like the practical preservation of a newly acquired asset. She clutched her daughter, who was wrapped in the only good blanket they owned, and bent her head against the stinging ice crystals, her world reduced to the plodding rhythm of the mule's hooves and the broad, unmoving back of the man leading them into the unknown. He lived in a valley that felt like the last fold in the world, a place the sun had to fight to find and was quick to abandon. They arrived late, the cabin a dark, low shape half buried in accumulating drifts, a single plume of smoke rising from its stone chimney into the maelstrom. It was not a home. It was a shelter, a bulwark against the wilderness, built with an eye for durability and a complete disregard for comfort. Inside, the place was brutally simple and immaculately clean. A single large room was dominated by a stone hearth where a low fire crackled. A rough-hewn table and two chairs stood in the center. A narrow ladder led to a sleeping loft. The air was cold and smelled of pine smoke, leather, and a profound, echoing emptiness. It was the home of a man who did not live in it so much as occupy it, a man keeping watch over his own solitude. He gestured for them to sit by the fire while he tended to the animals. The woman sank onto the hearth, the stone cold even through her thin dress, and pulled her children close. The sudden cessation of the wind's scream was deafening. The silence in the cabin was a different entity from the silence of the town. It was older, deeper, and seemed to press in on them from all sides. When the man returned, he moved with an efficient, quiet grace, stoking the fire and hanging a pot over the flames. He prepared a simple stew of salted meat and potatoes, the movements economical and practiced. He did not speak, and she did not dare to. He served the stew in 3 wooden bowls, handing them to her before taking his own portion and sitting at the table. The children ate with a desperate, frantic hunger that bordered on pain. The woman ate more slowly, forcing herself to chew, her eyes fixed on the man. He watched them, his expression detached, almost clinical. He was not observing a family. He was observing a phenomenon, cataloging the sharp angles of their cheekbones, the ravenous way they scraped their bowls clean. He was gauging the depth of their starvation, and she felt a hot flush of shame rise in her cheeks. The gulf between them was immense. He was a man who had food to spare. They were people who had forgotten what it felt like not to be hungry. When they were finished, he took the bowls without a word. "The loft is yours," he said, his voice flat. He pointed to a large wooden chest in the corner. "Blankets are in there. I'm up before dawn." The dismissal was clear. They were a necessity he had acquired, a problem he had solved. He banked the fire and retreated to a simple cot on the far side of the room, turning his back to them and pulling a single thin blanket over himself. The woman gathered her children and climbed the ladder into the cold, dark loft. The blankets in the chest were coarse but clean and thick. As she wrapped her children in them, she felt a strange and unsettling fear. The man's impersonal charity felt as sharp and dangerous as the winter itself, a blade whose edge she had yet to understand. She lay down between her sleeping children, listening to the howl of the storm outside and the measured, steady breathing of the stranger below, and wondered if she had traded one kind of wilderness for another. The blizzard raged for 3 days, imprisoning them in the small cabin. It was a period of intense, suffocating quiet, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the mournful shriek of the wind. The man was a restless presence, a creature of constant motion. He mended tack with meticulous, practiced stitches, sharpened axes and knives until their edges gleamed, and planed a stack of rough lumber with a rhythmic, scraping sound that set the woman's teeth on edge. He never seemed to rest. He moved from one task to the next with a grim determination, as if idleness was an enemy he had to keep at bay. She in turn learned his rhythms. She learned that he drank his coffee black and scalding hot before the sun was even a rumor in the sky. She learned that he preferred the cabin organized with a rigid, almost military precision. She learned that the silence he cultivated was not peaceful but vigilant. During one of her quiet explorations of their cramped quarters, while he was in the small attached lean-to, she noticed a small object on a high, dusty shelf above the hearth. Standing on a stool, she reached for it. It was a small bird, crudely carved from a piece of pine, its wings half spread. It was a child's toy, worn smooth by small hands. She placed it back exactly as she had found it, a cold knot forming in her stomach. The cabin's emptiness suddenly had a name. It was not solitude. It was loss. On the fourth morning, they awoke to a world transformed. The wind had died, and an absolute crystalline silence had fallen. The snow had stopped. Outside, the valley was buried under a thick, pristine blanket of white, the sunlight dazzling on its surface. The man pulled on his boots and coat, his face set. The storm's retreat had not brought relief, only revealed the mountain of work it had left in its wake. Fences would be down, the path to the barn and the well would need to be cleared, and the roof of the lean-to was groaning under a heavy load. He expected to do it all alone. It was what he always did. But as he grabbed a shovel, the woman appeared at his side, dressed in a pair of his old wool trousers tied at the waist with a rope and a shirt that hung on her like a shroud. Her son stood beside her, holding a smaller shovel the man used for the hearth ash. "We will help," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it was not a plea. It was a statement. She would not be a sheltered pet, a helpless mouth to feed. She would earn her keep and more. She would prove they were not a burden. He looked at her, then at the boy, whose small face was a mask of serious intent. A flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, or grudging respect, passed through his eyes. He had assumed her to be as fragile as she looked. "The snow is deep," he said, a warning. "The work is hard." "We are not afraid of work," she replied, her chin high. He gave a curt nod and turned away, leading them out into the blinding white. The cold was shocking, but the air was clean and still. He set a relentless pace, expecting them to fall behind, to retreat to the warmth of the cabin. They did not. The woman worked with a fierce, wiry strength that surprised him. She was clever, anticipating where he would clear next, using her smaller shovel to clear the edges while he broke through the deep drifts. She did not complain. She did not tire. She simply worked, her movements efficient, her breathing a steady plume of white in the frigid air. Her son, mimicking his mother, worked with a child's frantic energy, his small shovel attacking the snow with surprising effect. By midday, they had cleared a path to the barn. Inside, he found her again, not resting, but organizing. The storeroom, which had been a chaotic jumble of tools, sacks, and old equipment, was being transformed. She moved with a purpose that bespoke an intelligence he had not anticipated, stacking grain sacks, hanging tools on the walls, creating order from his long-neglected chaos. Later that evening, after a meal eaten in their now customary silence, he watched as she took out a small sewing kit from her meager bundle. She picked up one of his work shirts, ripped at the elbow, and began to mend it. Her stitches were tiny, perfect, and impossibly neat. She was not just patching a hole, she was restoring the garment, her needle moving with a skill that was both beautiful and deeply practical. He found himself watching her more and more. He watched the way she comforted her daughter with a soft murmur, the way she praised her son for a small task done well. He saw not just a survivor, but a creator of order, of warmth, of a quiet, resilient dignity. She was not fragile, she was tempered steel, forged in a fire he could not imagine. A strange, unfamiliar feeling began to stir in the frozen soil of his heart. It was not warmth, not yet, but it was the distinct and undeniable feeling of a thaw. Weeks bled into one another, measured not by days but by the slow, laborious process of digging out from the great snow. The fragile refuge the man had offered began to feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a functioning household. But their isolation was a fragile bubble, and it was destined to pop. The need for supplies eventually grew unavoidable, forcing them on the 2-day journey back to the very town that had cast them out. The town looked different now, softened by the thick mantle of snow but just as cold in its heart. As the man was loading sacks of grain into his wagon, a fine, polished carriage, pulled by two perfectly matched gray horses, rolled to a stop nearby. A woman descended, wrapped in expensive furs and radiating an aura of untouchable wealth and influence. She was the wife of the valley's most powerful rancher, a woman whose pronouncements carried the weight of law in the small community. Her eyes, the color of a frozen lake, immediately found the man and the small family standing beside him. She drifted toward them, her silk dress rustling, a stark and vibrant splash of color against the town's drab winter palette. Her smile was a carefully constructed weapon, all pleasantry on the surface and pure malice underneath. "Well now," she began, her voice carrying clearly in the still air, ensuring a wide audience among the townsfolk who had stopped to watch, "I see you found yourself some company." Her gaze was a physical thing, sweeping over the woman and her children, cataloging their mended, ill-fitting clothes with open disdain. She made them seem like stray animals he had foolishly brought in from the cold. "Charity is a fine Christian virtue, of course," she continued, turning her smile back to the man. "But one must consider propriety. A woman and her children, living alone with you, so far from town. The talk, you understand. It sets a poor example. People will wonder about the nature of your arrangement." The insinuation was as sharp and ugly as a shard of broken glass designed to shame him, to isolate him, and to put him back in his solitary, predictable place. The entire street seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for his response. The man did not react as she expected. He did not flush with anger or stammer a defense. He simply finished tying off the last grain sack, his movements as deliberate as ever. Then he turned slowly to face her. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He stepped slightly to the side, a small, almost imperceptible movement that placed him squarely between the wealthy woman and the family she was attacking. He became a wall. "They work for me," he said, his voice a low, flat rumble that cut through the tension. "They are under my roof. Their propriety is my concern, not yours." The statement was absolute. It was a declaration of territory, a line drawn in the snow that she could not cross. It offered no excuses, no explanations. It simply stated a fact. The wealthy woman's smile faltered, the malice in her eyes flickering with surprise and fury at this unexpected defiance. She had expected him to be cowed, to be shamed into casting them out. Instead, he had claimed them. Publicly, her face tightened into a mask of cold rage. She gave a curt, vicious nod, turned on her heel, and swept back to her carriage, defeated. The ride home was undertaken in a new kind of silence. The air in the wagon was thick with unspoken things. The fragile piece of their isolated existence had been named, held up to public scrutiny, and defended. It had been made real, and in doing so, it had been made infinitely more vulnerable. Back in the cabin that night, the fire seemed to burn a little brighter, pushing back a little more of the darkness. The silence was no longer empty, nor was it merely watchful. It was heavy, weighted with the gravity of his public declaration. He had not just offered them a roof, he had offered them his protection. And they all knew, without saying a word, that this was only the first shot in a war they had not asked for. That night, the cabin felt smaller, the world outside larger and more menacing. The children slept in the loft, their peaceful breathing a stark contrast to the tension that crackled in the air below. The woman sat by the hearth, her hands busy mending a small tear in her son's shirt, but her mind was miles away, back in the frozen street, reliving the confrontation. The man sat at the table, methodically oiling a rifle, the soft, repetitive rasp of the cloth on steel, the only sound in the room. The quiet stretched, taut as a wire. Finally, she set the shirt aside. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely a whisper. Yet it cut through the silence like a blade. "Hey, why?" He stopped his work, his hands going still on the rifle stock. He did not look at her. "Why what?" "In the town," she clarified, her gaze steady on his broad back. "Why did you do that? You made an enemy of a powerful woman. For us. We are nothing to you." He remained silent for so long she thought he would not answer. He stared into the fire, the dancing flames reflecting in his dark, unreadable eyes. The ghosts of the cabin seemed to gather around him in the flickering light. When he finally spoke, his voice was rougher than usual, freighted with a history he kept locked away. "This cabin," he began, his words slow and measured, as if he were pulling them up from a great depth. "It used to have other voices in it, lighter ones." He swallowed, a difficult, painful motion. "My wife, my daughter, the fever took them, 3 winters ago." He still did not look at her. He spoke to the fire, to the ghosts only he could see. After they were gone, the silence, it got too loud. It wasn't empty. It was full of everything I'd lost. It echoed. He finally turned his head, and for the first time, she saw past the stoic emptiness in his eyes to the raw, cavernous grief behind it. It needed a different kind of quiet, the kind people make when they're just living, the sound of breathing in the loft, the sound of a needle pulling thread. He looked directly at her then, and the admission was stark, stripped of all artifice. You and your children, you brought a better silence, a silence that lets a man sleep. A single tear escaped her eye, tracing a clean path through the grime and weariness on her cheek. His confession was a key, unlocking her own guarded heart. She reached into the small, tightly wrapped bundle she kept with her always, her one connection to the life that had been stolen from her. Her fingers unwrapped the cloth to reveal a small, intricately carved jade butterfly. One of its delicate wings was broken clean off. She held it out on her palm. "My husband was a scholar," she said, her voice thick with memory. "He loved books more than he loved money. He was a good man, but not a practical one." She looked down at the broken treasure. "This was his wedding gift to me. He said we were two wings of the same butterfly." Her hand closed around it, the sharp edge of the break digging into her palm. "We ran from a man who said my husband owed him a great debt. A man who deals not in money, but in lives. When the soldiers came to our village, my husband told us to run. He stayed to face them, to face him." Her voice broke. "The man who holds the debt believes it is now mine to pay. He believes that we belong to him." The two revelations hung in the air between them, two halves of a single terrible story of loss. He finally understood. Her desperation was not just about poverty or starvation. She was not just a survivor. She was the hunted. He had seen himself as providing a simple refuge, a roof against the snow. Now he saw the truth with chilling clarity. The social shaming from the rancher's wife was a petty squall compared to the hurricane gathering on the horizon. He had not just brought workers into his home, he had brought fugitives into his fortress. And by defending them in that street, he had lit a beacon for the wolf that was hunting them. The relationship had transformed. He was no longer just a provider. He was now, and irrevocably, their protector. The thaw came, not as a gentle release, but as a muddy, weeping surrender. The world turned gray and brown, and the valley was choked with a thick, persistent mist. It was on one such morning, when the fog clung to the ground like a shroud, that a new shape emerged from the gloom. It was a polished black buggy, its wheels struggling through the mire, a vehicle utterly alien to this rough, untamed land. A man in a fine city suit and polished boots stepped out, his movements precise and unhurried. He was handsome, with a smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. The woman saw him from the cabin window, and a strangled gasp escaped her lips. It was him. He did not bother with pleasantries or threats. He walked to the porch where the man had come to stand, a rifle held loosely in one hand. The visitor was the picture of calm confidence, a predator who knew the trap was already sprung. He unrolled a long, yellowed document with a flourish. "The contract of indenture," he announced, his voice smooth and cultured, "signed by her late husband. The terms are quite specific. Upon his death, the debt and all attached obligations transfer to his next of kin, namely, her and by extension, her issue." He tapped a clause with a manicured finger. "The local magistrate in the territorial capital has already reviewed a copy. It is, I am assured, ironclad." He finally looked at the man, his smile widening. "You have 3 days to settle the debt in gold coin, a substantial sum. I'm afraid, if you cannot, the terms of the contract will be enforced. She and the children come with me. It is all perfectly legal." He rolled the document back up, his victory assured. He was not just a villain, he was the system, a corrupt and powerful force armed with the unassailable power of the law. The next 2 days were a descent into a quiet, desperate hell. The man had no gold. The ranch, mortgaged to the hilt after years of bad harvests and his own neglect, was barely solvent. They were trapped. The air in the cabin grew thick with unspoken fear. On the second night, the woman sat at the table, staring at the copy of the indenture contract the man had left, her tears falling silently onto the brittle paper. The rancher sat across from her, his face a grim mask, his mind racing through impossible scenarios. He watched her fingers trace the elegant, unfamiliar script of the contract. "You can read that?" he asked, his voice low. She looked up, surprised. "Yes, my husband taught me, the characters and numbers as well." He said a mind without learning was a locked room. A tiny, impossible spark of an idea flickered to life in the darkness of his despair. He rose and pulled a heavy dust-covered ledger from a high shelf. His own accounts. "Look at this," he said, pushing the book and the contract towards her. "Look for anything. A mistake, a loophole, anything." For the rest of the night, they worked by the flickering light eye of a single lantern. The cabin became a war room. While he stared uselessly at the columns of figures he barely understood, she bent over the pages, her brow furrowed in concentration. Her mind, starved for so long of anything but the brutal calculus of survival, came alive. She saw patterns he missed, her fingers flying across the pages, adding, subtracting, cross-referencing, and then she found it. A discrepancy. A date on the indenture, when cross-referenced with a shipping manifest mentioned in the fine print, proved that the contract had been signed a week after her husband's recorded death. It was a forgery, a clever one, but a forgery nonetheless. It was a sliver of hope, a crack in the villain's ironclad case. Before the sun had even touched the horizon, the man was on his horse, riding harder than he had in years. He rode not to the local town, but to a railway depot 2 valleys over, a place with a telegraph office that connected to the wider world. He sent a message to a name, in a city he had not spoken in a decade, a contact from a life he had tried to bury. The message was short, coded, a request for all information on the visitor and his business enterprises. It was a desperate long-shot gamble, a prayer sent out over a humming wire. On the third day, at noon precisely, the buggy returned. This time, the villain was not alone. The local lawman rode beside him, his face etched with apology. Behind them, in her own carriage, came the rancher's wife, her face a mask of smug, vindicated triumph. She had come to witness the final humiliation. "The law is the law," the lawman said, his voice heavy with reluctance as he dismounted. "I have my orders. The contract is binding." The villain smiled, stepping onto the porch. He reached for the woman's arm, who stood frozen with her children behind her. "Time to go," he said softly. At that exact moment, a sound cut through the tense silence, the frantic, desperate drumming of horses' hooves. A rider appeared over the rise, galloping at a dangerous, breakneck speed. It was the young boy from the telegraph office, his face flushed, waving a piece of paper. He slid his horse to a dusty halt and thrust the telegram into the rancher's outstretched hand. The man's eyes scanned the message, his grim expression hardening into one of cold, dangerous fury. He didn't say a word. He simply walked over and handed the telegraph to the lawman. The lawman read it, his eyes widening. He read it again, then slowly looked up, his gaze fixing on the smiling villain. "This man," the rancher said, his voice like ice, "is not a creditor. He's a fugitive. This is a federal bulletin. He's wanted in 3 territories for fraud, extortion, and running an indenture scam, targeting the families of the recently deceased. That contract in your hand is a forgery, just like all the others." The villain's smile evaporated, replaced by a sickly pallor. The rancher's wife stared in disbelief, her triumphant moment crumbling into ash. The lawman's hand moved, deliberately and without haste, to the handle of his pistol. He drew the weapon. "You're under arrest," he said, the reluctance gone from his voice, replaced by cold authority. As the stunned man was being shackled, the lawman turned back to the rancher. He looked at the woman and her 2 children, standing safe on the porch of the small cabin. He looked at the quiet, solitary man who had faced down the whole world to protect them. He lifted his hand to the brim of his hat and gave a slow, deliberate tip of respect. "Looks like you had it handled after all." The spring that followed was a season of repair, in the land and in the people. The meltwater washed away the last of the winter's grime, and the valley floor erupted in a riot of green. The sun, so long a stranger, returned to warm the earth, and with it came the sounds of life. The silence in the cabin was finally, truly broken, not by echoes of the past, but by the soft sounds of the present. The children's laughter became a constant welcome music as they chased new chickens around the yard. The ranch itself was transformed. It was no longer a place of mere occupation, but one of genuine habitation. The man started building a new room onto the side of the cabin, the steady, rhythmic report of his hammer, a declaration of permanence. It was not just a repair, it was an expansion, a physical manifestation of their growing future. The woman, for her part, had become his partner in every sense of the word. She managed the ledgers with a skill that continued to astound him, turning his barely solvent operation into a thriving enterprise. She planted a vast garden behind the cabin, her hands, once soft and scholarly, now competent and strong, coaxing life from the rich soil that would see them through the next winter and many more to come. The man was different, too. The harsh, brittle grief that had encased him for 3 years had cracked and fallen away, revealing the person he had been before. The severe lines around his eyes softened, crinkling now when he watched the children play. One afternoon, he sat with the boy on the porch steps, a block of pine and a sharp knife in his hands. He began to whittle, his large, calloused hands moving with surprising delicacy. He was carving a bird, a perfect, detailed replica of the worn, broken one she had found on the shelf. It was a gesture of healing, a way of acknowledging the past while building a new future. He even smiled now, a slow, rusty occurrence at first, but one that grew more frequent and natural with each passing day. It was a real smile, one that reached his eyes and lit them from within. She was no longer the hunted, haunted woman from the town square. The resilience she had always possessed now shone as a quiet, unshakable strength. She stood taller, her gaze direct, her voice steady, the townspeople, having witnessed the public and ignominious downfall of both her external tormentor and her local antagonist, treated them with a new, grudging respect. Whispers of scandal were replaced by murmurs of admiration for the solitary rancher and his capable, intelligent family. They were no longer outsiders, they were neighbors. The story ended one warm evening in late summer. The new room was finished, its fresh-cut pine scent mingling with the smell of honeysuckle on the breeze. The children were asleep inside, safe and sound. The two of them sat together on the newly built porch, watching the sun bleed purple and gold across the western peaks. He reached into his pocket and pulled out another carving. It was a butterfly, fashioned from a piece of pale, smooth birch wood, its wings spread as if in mid-flight. He had carved it to be a perfect mate to the broken jade one she kept on the mantelpiece. He didn't say anything. He simply placed the wooden butterfly into her open palm. It was warm from his hand. She looked from the carving to his face, her eyes full of a gratitude and affection that needed no words. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, his touch gentle but firm. They sat in comfortable silence for a long moment, watching the last of the light fade from the sky. "A home," he said finally, his voice quiet but sure, a deep and resonant sound in the tranquil twilight. "It's not the land you own or the roof you build." He looked at her, his gaze holding hers. "It is the people you choose to stand with on the porch when the day is done." And in that shared silence, beneath a sky full of new stars, they both knew they were finally home.